She yanked open the back door of the black car without looking up, one hand clutching her phone, the other already pulling herself inside. The leather seat was cold against her palm. "I'm late," she said sharply, breath uneven. "Please drive." The door shut with a heavy, final sound. The car did not move. For half a second, she didn't notice. Her eyes were still on the cracked screen of her phone, the Uber app frozen, the battery icon flashing red like a warning she'd ignored for too long. Then the silence registered. No engine reverend. No navigation voice. Just a deep, unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow the air. A soft click echoed through the cabin. The doors locked. Her head snapped up. In the front seat, a man turned slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. His movements were deliberate, controlled. He wasn't startled. He wasn't angry. He looked curious. "You're not my Uber," he said calmly. Her heart slammed so hard it felt like it knocked the breath out of her chest. She lunged for the handle, fingers slick with sweat, yanking once, twice. It didn't budge. I'm sorry," she stammered, panic rising fast, sharp, irrational. "I made a mistake. Please unlock the door." He watched her without interrupting, eyes steady, assessing. Not predatory. Not kind either. Just observant, like someone used to reading situations before deciding how to respond. Then, without breaking eye contact, he pressed a button. The locks clicked open. "You can leave," he said. She froze. The door was unlocked. She could feel it. All she had to do was push and step back onto the sidewalk. But outside the tinted window, the city suddenly felt hostile. Night traffic crawled past. Neon signs flickered. And just a few meters away, two men stood near a lamppost, arguing in low voices. One of them glanced in her direction. Their eyes met. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't recognition in his eyes. It was calculation. She swallowed and slowly withdrew her hand from the door handle. "My phone died," she lied, her voice softer now, carefully controlled. "I just need 1 minute. Please." The man in the front seat studied her again. The tension in her shoulders. The way her knees were angled inward, defensive. The faint tremor she was trying to suppress. He had seen fear before, real fear, not the performative kind people used to manipulate sympathy. "Fine," he said. He didn't ask questions. He didn't start the car. He simply waited. The interior was immaculate. No dangling chargers. No dashboard clutter. No Uber tablet. The kind of car that didn't need to advertise what it was. The kind of car owned by someone who never needed permission to be anywhere. Her breathing slowed, but her thoughts raced. She told herself this was just another tight spot. Another moment she'd have to endure quietly. She had learned that skill early, how to disappear in plain sight, how to survive without drawing attention, how to read danger before it announced itself. From the corner of her eye, she noticed his hand move. He lifted his phone briefly, typed something with his thumb, then placed it face down. No ringtone. No vibration. Just a decision made. Outside, one of the men by the lamppost took a step closer to the car. Her chest tightened. She didn't know why she hadn't left when she had the chance. She only knew that, for reasons she couldn't yet explain, the wrong car felt safer than the right street. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet, unsettling thought surfaced, one that made her grip her dead phone like a talisman. This mistake was going to cost her something. Or change everything. The man didn't turn the engine on right away. Instead, he shifted slightly in his seat and angled the rearview mirror just enough to see her more clearly. Not intrusively. Precisely. Like someone aligning a lens. Outside, the two men had stopped arguing. One laughed, low and humorless. The other checked his phone, then looked up again, this time longer. His gaze lingered on the black car as if measuring it, weighing risk against reward. She felt the instinctive urge to shrink. "You don't need to be afraid," the man in front said, his voice level, unhurried. I unlocked the door. I know, she replied quickly. Too quickly. She forced her hands to relax in her lap. I just needed a second. A second usually turns into a story, he said. And a story usually has a reason. She said nothing. Silence settled between them, thick but not hostile. The city noise seeped faintly through the glass, horns, distant sirens, the restless pulse of people moving somewhere with purpose. She wondered where he was going. Somewhere important, clearly. People like him always were. He started the engine at last. The low hum vibrated through the seat, grounding and dangerous all at once. I can drop you off, he said. Wherever you're actually going. Her first instinct was to refuse. Accepting help always came with a cost. She had learned that lesson the hard way. But her interview flashed through her mind, the email marked final opportunity, the time circled twice on her calendar, the rent reminder blinking unread in her inbox. I'm supposed to be downtown, she said carefully. East District. He didn't react. Just pulled smoothly into traffic, merging as if the road had been waiting for him. As they drove, she became acutely aware of details she hadn't noticed before. The absence of a driver partition. The faint scent of cedar instead of synthetic air freshener. The way the car moved, not rushed, not cautious, but assured. This wasn't someone who worried about tickets or wrong turns. Her gaze drifted to the center console despite herself. A wallet lay there, slightly open. She didn't mean to look, but her eyes caught on a flash of matte black. A card with no logo. No numbers. Just a name embossed so subtly it almost blended into the surface. His name. Her throat tightened. She knew that name. Not personally, but culturally. Financial headlines. Podcasts. A company that had swallowed competitors whole without scandal. A man rumored to be ruthless, untouchable, allergic to weakness. Her pulse roared in her ears. She forced her eyes away before he could notice, fixing her gaze on the passing streetlights instead. She kept her face neutral, her breathing steady, as if nothing had happened. As if her world hadn't just tilted on its axis. In the front seat, his eyes flicked briefly to the mirror. He saw the moment her posture changed. The instant realization settled into restraint. Most people reacted when they recognized power. Fear. Or greed. She reacted with silence. That interested him. His phone vibrated once this time, a single muted pulse. He didn't look at it. He already knew what it said. Security was nearby. The men on the sidewalk were no longer a concern. The woman in his back seat, however, had just become one. And neither of them yet understood why this ride was no longer about getting from one place to another. She broke the silence first, as if speaking might keep the air from closing in on her thoughts. Thank you, she said, staring straight ahead. For not making it a thing. He smiled faintly, the expression brief and unreadable. People make things a thing all by themselves, he replied. I just give them space. The car glided through traffic with unnerving ease. Each red light seemed to turn green just as they approached, as though the city itself had adjusted its rhythm for him. She noticed how other drivers instinctively gave way, how no one honked when he merged late. Power, she realized, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply expected obedience. Her mind drifted despite her efforts to stay present. The motion of the car, the low hum of the engine, it pulled her backward into memories she usually kept locked away. She was 19 again, sitting in a cramped office with flickering fluorescent lights. Her first internship. Her first taste of a world where confidence mattered more than competence. She remembered how her supervisor had leaned too close, how his praise had slowly twisted into entitlement. How she'd laughed it off at first, then learned to keep doors open, then learned to document everything quietly, just in case. That habit, quiet documentation, was the only reason she was still standing now. East District, he repeated, as if testing the words. Interview. Her chest tightened. She hadn't realized she'd nodded. Yes. You're late. She exhaled sharply. I know. He didn't press. Instead, he took a different turn, one she didn't recognize. Her pulse spiked. This isn't the fastest route, she said before she could stop herself. It is, he replied. If you want to arrive composed. She almost laughed at that. Almost. Composure had always been a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd learned to function through chaos, to smile while her insides rattled. Still, something in his tone made her sit back, loosen her grip on her bag. The bag itself was frayed at the edges. Old leather. Repaired more than once. He noticed that too. Most people noticed clothes. Watches. Shoes. He noticed what people held onto. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, streaking the windows and blurring the city into abstract light. The two men from earlier were long gone, but their presence lingered in her body, a residual tension that hadn't yet drained away. Her phone buzzed weakly in her hand, a final gasp of life. A notification flashed across the screen before it went dark completely. Unknown number, don't forget who has power here. Her stomach dropped. She clenched her jaw, willing herself not to react. She slipped the phone into her bag slowly, deliberately. Too deliberately. In the mirror, his eyes met hers. Just for a second. He didn't ask what she'd seen. He didn't ask who had texted her. But something shifted in his expression, not concern, not anger, but recognition. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone being reminded of a debt they never agreed to owe. The car accelerated slightly, the engine responding like a restrained animal finally given permission to run. Whatever waited for them downtown, he decided, it could wait another minute. The rain thickened as they crossed into the older part of the city, where buildings stood closer together and the streets carried the weight of years instead of ambition. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm, almost hypnotic, and before she realized it, the memories she had been holding back began to surface with more clarity than she wanted. She hadn't always lived like this, measuring exits, memorizing faces, bracing for consequences that never quite explained themselves. There had been a time when her life felt ordinary, even hopeful. She grew up in a narrow apartment that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled rice. Her father had been a quiet man with hands permanently stained from factory work, the kind of man who believed dignity came from endurance. When he got sick, everything else rearranged itself around that fact. Hospital visits replaced school events. Bills stacked where books used to sit. Her mother learned how to smile at doctors while calculating how many more shifts she could physically survive. Scholarships became her escape route. Not a dream, an exit plan. She studied harder than anyone she knew, not because she loved the subjects, but because failure wasn't an option. When she finally got into a reputable firm as an intern, she thought she had crossed the invisible line that separated surviving from living. She was wrong. The memory sharpened as the car slowed near a red light. She remembered the office where it began, the polite comments, the subtle touches disguised as guidance, the way praise became conditional. She remembered the day she said no. The day the air in the room changed. The day she was called difficult, then ungrateful, then quietly removed from projects until her position disappeared altogether. She had reported it. Carefully. With evidence. Nothing happened. Instead, the man who had cornered her in that office walked away untouched, and she walked out carrying a reputation she hadn't earned. In certain circles, her name became a warning rather than a resume. That was when the messages started. Indirect at first. Then clearer. Reminders that power didn't like being challenged. That silence was rewarded. Resistance punished. The two men she had seen earlier weren't random. They were part of the pressure. Not illegal. Just close enough to make her doubt her own safety. The car stopped. She blinked, pulled back into the present. They were parked now, just outside the East District, but not in front of the building she recognized. Instead, they sat beneath an overhang, shielded from the rain, the city momentarily held at bay. "You're shaking," the man said quietly. She hadn't realized she was. I'm fine, she replied out of habit. He turned in his seat slightly, not enough to intimidate, just enough to be present. You don't have to explain anything, he said. But if someone is trying to scare you, you should know that fear only works when you're alone. The words landed heavier than she expected. She studied him then, not as a symbol, not as a name, but as a man who had chosen not to look away. She didn't trust him yet. But for the first time that night, she felt something dangerously close to relief. Outside, the rain eased, as if waiting. This interview, she realized, was no longer the most important thing happening tonight. He checked the time on the dashboard display, then glanced at her again, more openly now. You still want to go in? He asked. She followed his gaze to the building across the street. Glass and steel, lit from within like a promise that only worked from a distance. Her interview was scheduled to start in 7 minutes. She calculated how long it would take to cross the street, dry her hands, fix her expression, and pretend she wasn't unraveling. Yes, she said. The answer came out firmer than she felt. I need this. He nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing else. The engine didn't cut off. Instead, the car remained idling, a quiet presence behind her decision. Then let's do this properly, he said. She frowned. What do you mean? He reached into the center console, retrieving a slim folder she hadn't noticed before. No logo. No branding. He flipped it open briefly, scanning something, then closed it again. You said this is your final interview, he continued. That means you've already been evaluated on paper. Tonight isn't about competence. It's about composure. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. I don't have time for mind games. He met her eyes in the mirror, unoffended. Good. Neither do I. For a moment, she thought he might say more, explain himself, maybe even reveal who he was outright. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the console. A key card. Black. Unmarked. Her breath caught. She recognized that kind of card. Restricted access. Executive level. I'm going inside too, he said calmly. Different meeting. She swallowed. You work here. I own things that work here, he corrected. There it was. Not a declaration. Not a boast. Just a statement of fact, delivered the same way someone might say the sky was overcast. Her mind raced. 100 instincts screamed at once: danger, opportunity, retreat, disbelief. She forced herself to stay still, to listen instead of react. That instinct had saved her before. If anyone asks, he added, you rode in with me because you were early. I was late, she said quietly. He gave a small, knowing smile. Not tonight. Outside, the rain finally stopped. People began emerging from nearby buildings, umbrellas closing, conversations resuming. The world moved on, unaware that something had shifted inside a parked car. He reached back and opened her door for her, the gesture surprisingly ordinary. Take a breath, he said. Whatever they think they know about you, let them be wrong. She stepped out onto the pavement, the cool air sharp against her skin. For the first time in months, her shoulders straightened without effort. She didn't feel safe exactly, but she felt seen. As she walked toward the building, she felt his gaze on her back, thoughtful, assessing. This wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was interest. An interest, she knew, could be just as dangerous as fear. She pushed through the revolving doors, unaware that behind her, he was already making decisions that would ripple far beyond this night. Inside the building, the air changed immediately. It was warmer, quieter, polished to a kind of perfection that made imperfection stand out. Her shoes clicked too loudly on the marble floor, and for a fleeting moment, she was aware of every scuff on her bag, every crease in her jacket. Old habits rose up fast: make yourself smaller, don't draw attention, don't give them a reason. She checked in at the front desk, gave her name, and was directed toward the elevators. As she waited, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Her eyes looked sharper than she expected. Tired, yes, but focused. Like someone who had already survived worse than this. The elevator doors slid open. He stepped in behind her. No announcement preceded him. No one rushed forward. But the atmosphere shifted all the same. Conversations lowered. A man in an expensive suit straightened his posture without realizing why. A woman holding a tablet paused mid-sentence. Power didn't always demand acknowledgement. Sometimes it simply rewrote the room. He stood beside her, close enough that she could sense his presence without looking. She didn't. She kept her eyes forward, her hands still, her breathing steady. The elevator began its ascent. "You don't have to change who you are in there," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They'll try to measure you. Let them. Just don't measure yourself by their rulers." Her throat tightened at the words. They landed too close to truths she rarely allowed herself to think about. The elevator stopped on her floor. She stepped out without hesitation. The doors closed behind her, and she was suddenly alone again, standing in a sleek hallway lined with abstract art and soft lighting. The interview room was at the end. Inside, 3 people waited. 2 men, 1 woman. All well-dressed. All practiced in neutrality. They smiled when she entered, gestures polished by years of repetition. As the questions began, she answered steadily. Not defensively. Not eagerly. She spoke of her work, her ideas, her failures. She didn't over-explain the gap in her resume. She didn't apologize for it either. Halfway through, the door opened. The room stilled. He walked in as if he belonged there, because he did. Chairs shifted. Someone stood too quickly, then sat back down. "Continue," he said, taking a seat against the wall. "I'm listening." The questions changed after that. Subtle at first, then sharper. Ethical scenarios. Pressure tests. One of the men mentioned her former employer by name, watching her carefully, waiting for her to falter. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the reflex to retreat. But then she remembered the text. The fear. The silence that had been demanded of her. And she chose differently. She told the truth. Not emotionally. Not dramatically. Just plainly. The room went quiet. Against the wall, he watched her not as a CEO, not as a strategist, but as a man seeing confirmation of something he had sensed from the beginning. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a crossing. And once crossed, there would be no going back. The silence in the room stretched longer than she expected. Not awkward, heavy. The kind that settled after something irreversible had been said. One of the interviewers cleared his throat and shuffled the papers in front of him, though she could tell he wasn't reading them. The woman across the table avoided her eyes, staring instead at the neat edge of her notepad as if it might offer guidance. Against the wall, he hadn't moved. She felt suddenly exposed, as though the truth she'd spoken had stripped away the thin armor she'd spent years constructing. There was a familiar fear in that vulnerability, the fear that honesty would once again cost her everything. The man who had mentioned her former employer spoke again, his tone carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes," she replied evenly. "It is. And you understand," he continued, "that claims like that can follow a person. Especially when they aren't substantiated in court." She did understand. Too well. Her fingers curled slightly under the table, a small, unconscious movement. "I understand," she said. "I also understand that silence doesn't make something untrue. It just makes it convenient." For the first time since he entered the room, the man against the wall straightened. "Enough," he said. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every head turned toward him. He stood slowly, the movement unhurried, and walked to the table. As he did, something in the atmosphere shifted, like gravity had increased just enough for everyone to feel it. He placed his hands on the polished surface and looked at each interview in turn. "You asked her to be honest," he said. "She was." One of the men swallowed. "We were just clarifying." "No," He interrupted calmly. You were testing whether discomfort would make her retract the truth. It didn't. He turned then, finally, to her. She met his eyes. For a fleeting moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the man who had everything, and the woman who had risked the last of hers. Do you know why I came in unannounced? He asked her. She shook her head. Because I stopped trusting curated impressions a long time ago, he said. People perform when they think they are being watched. I wanted to see what you'd do when you didn't know who was listening. A memory flickered through her mind, his calm voice in the car, the unlocked door, the choice he'd given her without explanation. None of it had been accidental. One of the interviews shifted nervously. With respect, the woman said, we still have protocol. He looked at her, and she stopped speaking. Protocol exists to protect institutions, he said. Not truth. He reached into his jacket and placed a familiar black card on the table. It caught the light briefly, unmistakable now to everyone in the room. I am not here to observe this interview, he continued. I am here because this interview revealed something the process was designed to miss. Her heart pounded. She didn't know whether to feel hope or fear. He turned back to her. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, will not be because you entered the wrong car. The weight of his words settled slowly, deliberately. Outside the room, unseen but already in motion, systems were shifting. Files being pulled. Names being cross-checked. Decisions being made at levels she had never been allowed to touch. She had told the truth. And for the first time in her life, the truth had not fallen into silence. No one spoke after that. The kind of silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recalibration. Every person in the room was quietly reassessing where they stood in relation to him, to her, to what had just been exposed. He broke eye contact first, turning back to the interview panel. I want the room, he said. There was a fraction of a second where protocol tried to resist out of habit. Then chairs scraped back. Tablets were gathered. Apologies formed and died before reaching anyone's lips. Within moments, the interviews filed out, the door closing softly behind them. She remained seated. Only then did she realize how hard her heart was beating. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice steady but low. Intervene. I didn't, he replied. I observed. The outcome changed on its own. She studied him more closely now, without the pressure of an audience. He looked different here than he had in the car, less guarded, though no less controlled. This space belonged to him in a way the street never had. You knew, she said. It wasn't a question. Before we came in. About my former employer. I suspected, he corrected. Your reaction in the car confirmed it. Her brow furrowed. My reaction? When you saw the message, he said. You didn't panic. You didn't ask for help. You contained it. People who are lying don't do that. They deflect. You absorbed it. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For years, her instincts had been framed as weakness, too cautious, too quiet, too careful. Hearing them described as discernment felt disorienting. He walked to the window, looking out over the city. The rain had washed the streets clean, reflections shimmering below. I grew up watching people confuse volume with authority, he said. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the most dangerous. She stood then, moving to join him, though she kept a respectful distance. So what happens now? She asked. He turned slightly. Now comes the part where most people expect a reward. Her pulse skipped. She didn't like the sound of that. I don't want, she began. I know, he said, cutting her off gently. You don't want favors. You don't want protection. You want a fair field. She nodded. Exactly that. Then this is what will happen, he continued. An independent review will be opened. Quietly. Your former employer's name will come up. So will the names of anyone who helped bury the report. Her stomach tightened, not with fear this time, but with something sharper. Anticipation. And you? She asked. He met her gaze fully now. You will be offered a position. Not because of tonight. But because you were already qualified before anyone tried to erase you. She searched his face for conditions. For expectations. There were none. In that moment, she understood something crucial. This man didn't collect loyalty the way others collected power. He collected truth. And once given, he defended it relentlessly. Outside the room, the city kept moving, unaware that a quiet reckoning had begun. And it had all started because she entered the wrong car, and chose, again and again, not to lie. The offer didn't settle immediately. It hovered between them, weightless and heavy at the same time. She had spent so long preparing herself for rejection that acceptance felt unreal, like stepping onto solid ground after years of bracing for a fall. I need to be clear, she said at last. If this comes with expectations, silence, gratitude, loyalty beyond my job, I can't accept it. A lesser man might have bristled. He didn't. That's exactly why I'm making it, he replied. I don't need gratitude. I need people who don't bend when pressure is applied. He reached for the folder she had seen earlier in the car and placed it on the table between them. This time, he opened it fully. Inside were documents neatly arranged, performance reviews from her internship, anonymized feedback from colleagues who had quietly supported her, timelines that showed when her name had been removed from projects and how quickly her former supervisor had been promoted afterward. Her breath caught. You already had this. I had pieces, he said. Tonight filled in the pattern. A flicker of memory surfaced for him then, his own, sharp and unwelcome. A younger version of himself sitting in a boardroom years ago, watching a senior partner smile while lying without blinking. He had spoken up that day. The cost had been immediate. The lesson permanent. He had promised himself then that if he ever held enough power to change the rules, he would. She closed the folder slowly. What about the people outside this room? She asked. The ones who still think silence is safer. They'll see, he said simply. Change doesn't need announcements. It needs consequences. A knock came at the door. His assistant stepped in, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with understanding. She handed him a tablet. It's confirmed, she said. Internal audit flagged inconsistencies. HR is escalating. He nodded once. Good. The assistant glanced at the woman, just briefly, then back to him. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps. Respect. When the door closed again, the room felt quieter, as if it were holding its breath. You should go home, he said. Tonight has been enough. She managed a small smile. That's the first thing we agree on. As they walked toward the elevators together, she felt the tension in her body finally begin to loosen. Not disappear, but ease. Outside, the city lights blurred past the glass walls, indifferent and vast. At the elevator, he stopped. Tomorrow, he said, someone from my office will reach out. Take your time deciding. She nodded. I will. The doors slid open. She stepped inside, then hesitated, turning back. For what it's worth, she said, I didn't get into your car because I thought you could save me. I know, he replied. You got in because you were trying to survive. The doors closed between them. As the elevator descended, she rested her head lightly against the wall, eyes closing for just a moment. Somewhere above her, decisions were unfolding that would change careers, reputations, lives. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet realization took root. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The next morning, she arrived at the office early, not because she felt obligated, but because curiosity had replaced apprehension. The lobby was still quiet, a hushed prelude to the storm of activity that would soon awaken the building. She had barely taken her first step toward the elevators when she felt it, the subtle awareness of being watched, not in judgment, but in calculation. She didn't need to turn. He was already there, standing near the reception with that same calm certainty. He didn't smile. He didn't gesture. He simply acknowledged her presence with a nod, an imperceptible acknowledgement that carried weight far beyond recognition. The elevator ride was wordless. Each floor they passed held the rhythm of a city beginning its day, offices flicking to life, cleaning crews finishing early morning rounds, faint murmurs of conversation seeping through the glass walls. She noticed the way he observed it all, each movement, each pause. Not with impatience. Not with expectation. But with the meticulous understanding of someone who had to predict behavior because consequences were never forgiving. When they stepped onto her floor, he opened the door for her. She felt the old instinct, stay small, be quiet, surfacing, but it no longer had the power to dominate. She walked past the receptionist, past colleagues who glanced at her curiously, and toward the conference room where she had been instructed to wait. Inside, her former colleagues were seated. Their faces reflected varying degrees of surprise, discomfort, and calculated neutrality. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition that the truth she had spoken the night before was about to ripple outward. The door opened, and he entered, taking his place at the head of the table. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he scanned the room, pausing briefly on each person as if weighing their relevance to the events about to unfold. Then, in a voice both calm and unwavering, he addressed the room. "Let's be clear," he began. "What you've known about internal evaluations, performance reviews, and accountability is incomplete. The truth is rarely inconvenient. It's usually inconvenient for those who avoid it." A murmur rippled through the room. People shifted in their seats. The woman who had looked neutral yesterday now fidgeted with a pen. One of the men swallowed visibly, his eyes flicking to her for confirmation, but she held her gaze forward, composed. He continued, his voice low but carrying authority. "The audit initiated last night revealed discrepancies, omissions, and deliberate obfuscations. Those responsible will be held accountable. This is not arbitrary. It is methodical." Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sharp clarity of the moment. The weight of years of being silenced, ignored, and underestimated suddenly found context. And he wasn't just acknowledging it. He was correcting it. He turned his attention to her, and she felt the gravity of his gaze, not as a test, but as recognition of integrity. "You entered my car last night by accident. But you entered this process by choice. And that distinction matters more than you know." The room remained silent, the tension tangible, as the implications of his words began to sink in. She understood fully that this night, the wrong car, the truth spoken, the fear confronted, was not simply a prelude to a career opportunity. It was a reckoning, a moment where power and honesty intersected, and she had passed through unscathed, yet changed forever. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Inside, lives were shifting, reputations were being rewritten, and a woman who had long been taught to shrink now stood, fully seen, in the light of acknowledgement she had fought years to deserve. The conference room felt charged, the kind of energy that made everyone hyper-aware of the smallest movements. She stood at the edge, silently observing as the CEO walked to the far side of the room. His presence alone rearranged the dynamics. People who had been confident yesterday now questioned their assumptions. "You have been tested in ways that the formal process could never capture," he began, voice calm, deliberate. "And some of you failed that test." Eyes flicked around the room. Subtle shifts, nervous glances. One of her former colleagues, the man who had once dismissed her claims, straightened, but his hands betrayed tension. His shallow breaths were the only indication of the storm about to break. "I have reviewed everything," the CEO continued. "Documents, emails, testimonies. Patterns emerged that confirm what was suspected, and what should never have been allowed to continue." Her pulse thrummed in her ears. The air seemed to constrict. She knew this moment could have gone differently. One misstep, one hesitation, and all of her truth-telling might have been interpreted as weakness. He reached for the black card again, placing it on the table, not as a weapon but as a marker, a symbol of authority and decision-making power. "Those who enabled wrongdoing will face consequences immediately." The man who had dismissed her gasped audibly. Others shifted, glancing at each other in quiet panic. She could feel the ripples of accountability spreading outward, touching everyone in subtle but undeniable ways. Then, finally, he turned to her. The room seemed to contract around them. "And you," he said. "You spoke truth when silence was expected. You acted with integrity when convenience demanded compromise." Her chest tightened. She had trained herself for moments like this, not the praise, but the exposure, the scrutiny, the quiet judgment of power. Yet his words were different. They weren't condescending. They weren't transactional. They were recognition. "You will be offered a position," he said. "Not because of my intervention. Not because of loyalty. Because you earned it before anyone tried to erase you." She felt a flicker of disbelief. "And the others?" she asked softly, nodding toward her former colleagues. "Consequences," he replied simply. "Some will leave. Some will learn. The rest will adjust. But the truth remains constant. Integrity is rewarded, dishonesty is corrected. That is all." The room went silent. Not the tense silence of fear, but the charged silence of revelation. People were processing, recalculating, measuring where they stood now. She understood fully that this was more than a job offer. This was vindication. Recognition of every quiet struggle, every calculated decision to survive ethically, every instance where she had chosen restraint over reaction. He leaned back slightly, finally allowing a faint, approving expression. "You didn't enter my car last night by mistake. You entered a series of choices that brought you here. And in doing so, you reminded everyone else that the truth cannot be hidden forever." Outside the windows, the city continued unaware. But inside, lives had shifted irreversibly. She had crossed a threshold, and there would be no turning back. And somewhere in the quiet satisfaction of justice served, she realized that the wrong car had been the right place to start everything. The day progressed, but the events of the morning left an indelible mark on the office. Every corner seemed quieter, sharper, as if the building itself had adjusted to the new order. She moved through it with a strange lightness, though her mind replayed the night's events with relentless clarity. By mid-afternoon, she was summoned to a smaller office overlooking the city skyline. The room was lined with bookshelves, filled not with decoration, but with evidence of meticulous work, reports, binders, awards, and photographs. In the center, he waited, seated behind a desk that had seen years of decisions, triumphs, and losses. She stepped in cautiously, the air thick with anticipation. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I wanted to ensure you understood the implications of last night," he replied. His voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of weight she hadn't heard before. "Not just the interview, not just the decisions, but the full scope of what your choices set into motion." He gestured to the skyline beyond the glass. "Power is often assumed, feared, or exploited. Rarely is it observed quietly and allowed to correct itself. What you did, entering that car, responding as you did, speaking truth, initiated a chain that will ripple further than you realize." Her throat tightened. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. She paused, searching for words that could encapsulate years of survival, courage, and quiet defiance. "I acted honestly." "Exactly," he said, leaning back. "And honesty, when applied under pressure, is the ultimate test. It separates those who perform for recognition from those who act because they must." She studied him, suddenly aware of the subtle details, the faint lines around his eyes, the restrained energy in his posture, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the desk. He was not merely a man who wielded wealth or influence. He was someone who had shaped consequences into a discipline, a force that recognized and rewarded integrity above all else. "Your former employer, the ones who tried to suppress the truth, they will face accountability," he continued. "Not as punishment, but as correction. You've reminded people that systems fail when ethics are ignored. And that is more powerful than wealth or position." She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders finally releasing. Relief mingled with a quiet awe. "And me?" He regarded her, thoughtful. "You are here because you were ready before anyone else realized it. That readiness, observation, composure, courage, is rare. I don't offer it lightly." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the enormity of the night's events and the day's revelations settling between them. Outside, the city continued in its indifferent rhythm, but inside that office, a pivotal shift had occurred. Finally, he spoke, softer this time. You entered the wrong car thinking it was an Uber. That choice seemed minor at the moment. But every moment has weight. Every decision carries potential. Tonight, you will remember it not as a mistake, but as the point where your path changed. She nodded, understanding fully that her life would never return to what it had been. She had survived, endured, and now, for the first time, been truly seen. As she stepped back into the hallway, the sunlight reflected off the glass walls, bright and unwavering. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet certainty bloomed. She would no longer hide in the shadows, she would no longer shrink from consequence, and she had finally earned the space to stand fully in her own truth. The wrong car had been the right place to start everything, and from here, everything would change.